everybody, and welcome back to another Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have four awesome Ruby developers. First, our guest rogue, we have Brian Ford. Brian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody, this is Brian. Let's see. I work on Rubinius for Engineer. That's probably the best way to tell you who I am. I've been working on that project almost since Evan announced it back in December, or maybe November 2006. I've been working on it since December of 2006.
That's awesome. I know a lot of people who use Rubinius are pretty happy with it, so that's terrific.
That's awesome to hear.
Yep. We also have James Edward Gray.
Yep, I'm back, and I'm going to try editing this podcast since that's been the popular request, so you guys can give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down on how it goes.
Yeah, and if somebody wants to sponsor this podcast, then maybe we could just hire somebody to do that, but yeah, I'm lazy, so I don't. And we also have Josh Susser.
Hey everybody, it's Joel, I'm from Dr. Nick. Good morning. We're trying a new time recording this podcast, so I hope we're all alert and chatty. Anyway, I'm calling in from San Francisco, and the thing that's occupying my attention a lot these days is Golden Gate Ruby Conference, which is just coming up in a couple weeks now. So it's driving me crazy, but in a good way.
That's exciting stuff. And I'm Charles Max Wood. I am the host of the Teach Me to Code and the Rails Coach podcasts, and I'm doing a whole bunch of other stuff. You can find most of that at teachmetocode.com. And right now I'm in Boulder, so it might sound a little bit different, but that's because I'm sitting in a hotel room talking into my laptop. So anyway, so let's get started. Josh, you picked the topic this week, so I'll let you go ahead and introduce it.
Okay, so the topic this week is what's wrong with Ruby,
Josh,
the way I think of this is...
Josh,
yep.
Can we get a definition of Ruby?
Ruby is a silicate crystalline gemstone. No, okay, so
that was about 4 too many syllables for my tired mind.
I was just sure he was going to make me define wrong.
No, I'll do that.
I'll define what.
Then the rest of it all depends on what your definition of the word is.
Oh, you went there. You really went there.
Which is left for an exercise.
So what's wrong with Ruby? Now I see what starting the recording earlier in the day has done to us. We don't have any pre-show to get all this out of our system first. Okay, so what's wrong with Ruby? And Ruby isn't perfect. No programming language is, but I assume since we're on this podcast, it's just our favorite language that we're using. And there's things wrong with it, things that could be better, things that drive us crazy every now and then. And I think one of the things that experienced Rubyists learn is how to deal with those things and not let them make you crazy. So that's where I was coming from when I thought of the topic.
So Brian had kind of an interesting pre-question when we asked him to join us for this episode. He started quizzing us on what exactly Ruby means. So Brian, you want to talk a little about that?
Sure. So it's a great question. What is wrong with Ruby? I think that, we see a lot of people write blog posts and talk about a variety of different things that I associate with Ruby. And being a little bit of a math head, I really like definitions. So, of course, I was curious, what exactly do I mean by Ruby? And I look at Ruby as a fairly complex onion, the very core sort of language, which has syntax and the semantics, how you make a class, how you make a method, this sort of thing. But I deal with a lot of stuff around that core every day working on Rubinius. I work on RubySpec a great deal, so that's sort of defining how the language works. But also, I write a ton of Ruby code in Rubinius. Our bytecode compiler is all in Ruby, for instance. And as I'm working on that, I'm contrasting what I hear from people about their experiences engineering Ruby applications and Rails applications, and then there's many things around Ruby, like the testing with either unit test or RSpec or Cucumber, and there's fairly avid engineering community that looks at things like patterns and how to write better code. So I'm really interested in the question, and I actually have things that I could say are, in my opinion, wrong with Ruby, if we can go define wrong, at all those different levels. So it's a fascinating topic.
So you're thinking kind of the levels being language, implementation, sounded like maybe community, or maybe just culture would be a better word, and then the ecosystem in general.
Absolutely. That's a really good way to summarize it.
So, all right, so let's start picking on some things. Josh had a list generated, didn't you, Josh?
So I actually started going through a list of, putting together a list of what I thought was, problems with Ruby, or things that were wrong, things that I didn't like. And I realized that a lot of them had to do with ambiguity. So my favorite awful quirk in the Ruby language, in the syntax, or the processing of the syntax, I'm not even sure, is that the assignment of a value to something that looks like it could be a local variable or a setter method, and that's ambiguous to the programmer, although not to the compiler.
Right.
So I will try to sum up how Ruby does that, and then Brian can correct me on everything I get wrong, since he knows much better than me. But I believe what Josh is talking about is, like, if you say var equals, the way Ruby determines, or no, that wouldn't be the case, because that would always be a local variable, wouldn't it? Yeah, var equals would always be a local variable.
No, that's what you would think.
Is there any case where it's not? I can't think of one.
Well, if you're within the context of a model and you have, say, Atra accessor set up, or Atra writer, I think it is, I don't remember.
But in that particular case, you would have to qualify it with self.var equals. I believe the actual case is, say you have some method and then space var. Okay, so that's an actual ambiguity. The second, the var, if there's been a local variable assigned in the current scope, then it's the local variable. If there hasn't, it's the method called to the word var, I believe is the case.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, James. I think you have two cases there. There is the one case where you're setting an identifier equal to something, and that's always going to look like a local variable to Ruby. So if I say name equals Josh, then and I have an adder setter on my class name, Ruby is going to interpret name equals as a local variable assignment, and you have to give it an explicit receiver in order to disambiguate that for Ruby. I mean, it's a decision that could have been made the other way. It could have always looked up a method first, and maybe if that failed, said, oh, okay, I guess you want to set a local variable. But it's really something that trips people up. I assisted with a beginning programming for women class. We were covering some Ruby stuff, and the first non-trivial piece of Ruby that they wrote was a before save filter to upcase the name, and everybody hit this very problem. So it's one of those things that lurks. I spent a full day debugging when I didn't realize what was happening. I couldn't understand why my initialize method was not setting these attributes. I had made some complex setters. So it's a very ambiguous part of Ruby. It's a big trap. And there's another one that's kind of similar to it, James, that I think you were mentioning, and that's basically the ambiguity between an actual variable reference or a method call that is in Ruby. It's called a vcall. I think that stands for variable call, because if I just say name equals, and instead of a literal string like Josh, if I say name equals foo, and foo is an identifier. Foo could be a local variable, or it could be a method call with no receiver, nothing before the dot, and no arguments. And that case is ambiguous, and Ruby actually goes to a little more trouble to try to figure it out. It'll actually say, is there a local variable? If not, send a method call to try to find that method somewhere in the hierarchy. So those two cases, they're a little bit different. They're both ambiguous. They easily trip people up. And I would agree with Josh, one of my least favorite parts of Ruby.
The crazy thing about the thing you just mentioned is that at least the second case where you're doing something equals foo, that you can copy and paste out of one method and put it in another method in the same class, and I think it will always consistently be the same as long as you don't have a foo variable in one or the other methods. But the other case where you're assigning to an identifier, and that identifier can either be a local variable or a setter method, that will behave differently depending on whether on the rest of the context of the method. And the way that Ruby resolves that ambiguity of assignment is not based on whether you've done an assignment to a local variable in the method, but whether you've referred to that local variable in the method. So
that is a good point, but I think you're actually confusing it with the second case. In the first case, when you have var equals, it is always an assignment to a local variable, I believe. But in the second, it's not.
No. If you've referred to the method before, then it will treat it as a setter method. I think. I mean, the fact that it's so confusing to people who've been doing Ruby for many years is why I hate this.
This is a good point. This is if we're working this hard to define it. So I've definitely been bit by this in the past, where I was, assigning, and then I forgot to put the self in there, so you end up assigning to a local variable that just gets thrown away, and then you keep trying to figure out why you're losing data somewhere. I do want to say, in our little chat window here, Brian's showing us how to get Rubinius to decompile this stuff for you, to show you how it sees it as in X expressions, which is one of the awesome features of Rubinius. It's why I think Rubinius is the most transparent of all the virtual machines. You can feed it some code and pass the right command line switches, and it'll spit out basically a representation of how it sees that code. And because of that, you can see how Ruby resolves ambiguities like this. So I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Okay, so enough about this little word. What I would say is that if you're doing an assignment, a assignment to a setter method within your code, if there's any question about what you're doing, you should prefix it with, you should be explicit and say self.name equals.
Right.
Yeah, I think the self dot is the rule of thumb if you're using a setter method. If you want a local variable, use the name. If you want the setter, then put a self dot in front of it.
So I was just going to say that, this very interesting ambiguity in Ruby grammar, I mean, it's not this particular case with the setter is not really ambiguous to the grammar. The grammar just sees a local variable assignment. However, the ambiguity that we see as programmers in the code introduces some of the other things that I think are very interesting about Ruby, and potentially something you could say is wrong with Ruby. And I just want to sort of tie that in, that a lot of times how we are engineering our code, if we are making a complex setter, a setter is really something where inside the class we have access to the instance variable directly. That's in our scope, and we can do it. We can change its value directly. It's only when we start overriding the simple concept of setting an attribute inside of our class that we get into this case where we're calling a setter inside the class, and we have this weird thing where we didn't put a receiver because no one writes self dot, because that's implicit, right? If you don't have a receiver for a method call, then it's going to be sent to self. So I think that sort of identify something where it's not just the language that's a problem, but it's whether or not we're asking ourselves, why have I created this complex idea, wrapping a simple idea of setting an instance variable that I can do directly in my class, and instead I've added a bunch of logic around that. So now I'm required to call the setter inside my class, and then I run into the ambiguity that Ruby sees a local variable assignment, and I have to add self dot to tell Ruby exactly what I mean. So I think that's the sort of next level outside of the onion. I just want to tie that in. It's maybe not Ruby's fault. Maybe we're writing bad code that's tripping us up in this situation.
I don't think this is a Ruby thing. I remember this was a fairly significant topic of debate when I was working in Smalltalk 20 years ago. That do you access an instance variable directly, or do you wrap it up in getters and setters and talk to it that way? I think that is a cleaner, that leads to cleaner code. Working through accessor methods, even when you're within your own class, it makes for more malleable code. It's easier to refactor. If you decide, the name is no longer just an instance variable, it's something that I am composing out of a first name and a last name string, for instance, then you have much more flexibility, and you don't have to run around and hit your code all over the place if you change that. Sometimes that's a little Yagni, meaning you ain't gonna need that, or you ain't gonna need it, and you're getting ahead of yourself, and you're putting in flexibility that you're never going to take advantage of. But I think a lot of times it is useful to do that. And then there's things like if you're working in Active Record, you have to talk to those attributes as through accessor methods, because they aren't really instance variables.
Right. And you want to get all the goodnesses there with the dirty variables and stuff.
Yeah. Well, they're just
the case.
Yeah. Well, there just are no instance variables there. That's not how Active Record works. So, but the nice thing is that if you have something that's an instance variable and then you turn it into an attribute, you don't have to run around and find all those places where you talk to the instance variable. You just change the implementation of the method by replacing it with an attribute.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes something we forget. We kind of get into the habit of just doing ATTR reader, and saying or writer or whatever, and we have that. But then it's good to remember that sometimes you can, when you need to, you can rip that out and put in the full method and allow yourself to do something like when you return cents, because you always want to put cents in your database, you can switch it back to dollars and cents, which humans prefer to read, or something like that. So I do think it's usually a handy level of abstraction, although if it's not going to be set externally or messed with externally, then I don't see anything wrong with accessing the instance variable directly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Okay, so here's something that I want people to respond to, and that's that Ruby has this very there are many ways to do things right philosophy. It's fairly Perlish in that respect. It's much more than Python there's a one right way to do things approach. Ruby is very much all things to all people. So you can do blocks as do end, or you can put curly braces around them. And there's ampersand versus AND. So there's a lot of these, pick your own way of doing it, and which is great up to a point. But sometimes there's differences in how these things operate. So map and collect are synonyms for the same method, but ampersand and AND actually operate differently. So that is that something that's bad about the language, or is it something that's great about the language?
It's interesting. I have quite a few friends who I talk to that are Python developers. And so, they go way into the zen of Python, and there's only one right way to do any given thing, and so they tout that as a virtue. But at the same time, I really like the flexibility that I get out of Ruby. can you imagine writing a block on one line, writing it out, dot, map, do, pipe, variable, pipe, semicolon, something, semicolon, and I mean, the curly braces in that instance is very, very convenient. Unfortunately, I think you with the and the ampersand or whatever, it gets it's a little bit different because they actually do different things, and so you kind of have to take it on a case by case basis and make sure that what you're using is what you want. But I think in most cases it's a good thing because it really just provides you flexibility because it's just an alias to something else.
I came from Perl, definitely, so I guess I side with that community, and I learned using those constructs. So, for example, everybody does seem to be bothered by that ampersand versus A and D, and I really like it because the difference, basically the primary difference, is ampersand has a lower precedence than an equal sign, and A and D, maybe I should make that higher precedence than an equal sign, meaning it binds more tightly. And A and D has the lower precedence or binds more loosely. So if you have like var equals whatever A and D, or maybe we should use or in this case, OR, abort, blah, blah, blah. So basically you can say something like, assign this variable, or if we can't, let's just abort the script right now, which is very useful in like scripting and stuff. Whereas if you use the or, and on the equal side, it tries to do the first thing, and if it can't, it ors the second thing, and that's what ends up getting assigned because it's the difference in the equal sign. So I guess I did kind of learn using those tricks, and so they're very comfortable to me, but I can definitely understand where they make people uncomfortable because if you change, you can't just like do a search and replace through your code and replace A and D with ampersand. You may literally change the meaning of the code, which is definitely problematic, and people argue which ones to use in if conditionals and stuff like that should use the symbols or the words, which I tend to use the words just because I think they look better, and I'm generally not using an equal sign in a conditional, at least not a single equal. But a lot of people disagree with me on that. I think I'm in the minority, but anyways, I don't mind the choice, and I always prefer to have multiple ways to express myself, but I do understand why some people have that complaint.
What about aliases for things like map versus collect?
Well, map is just right and collect is just wrong.
Yeah, I love the fact that Ruby has aliases. Actually, it's absolutely one of my most favorite features. I've never been particularly confused by code using those different methods, and I found that it gives people a great bit of freedom to write code that makes a little more sense to them. And I think that's the same thing with and ampersand. The code visually looks different, and I only ever use ampersand if I am really explicitly wanting that higher precedence for something like assignment. And the AND is more like an expression in my mind, and so I find that the code flows more readily as I'm reading through. Ampersand is more visually jarring, and so I pay more attention. And especially if I see adder and equals something, it's I have to think more deeply about that code. This could be coming in initialized, and if it's not, then I want to change that behavior, that sort of thing. So I find, aliases and the different, the block with braces, and they're used in different ways to actually structure code, and not just the architectural structuring, but actually lexically structuring code, where different symbols get next to each other. And I find it really, really helpful in writing more expressive code.
I have a question about the aliasing of method names.
Okay.
So we have map and collect,
Right.
and so I go in and I override the implementation of collect or I put a novel implementation of collect in my. So I have a class. I include the enumerable module, and then I override collect.
Right.
So you wrote your code to call map on my object. What happens to my my collect method?
Yeah,
Good question.
In that case, I believe your new override would not be used because my understanding of Ruby's aliasing is that it's actually a copy, basically, at the time of alias.
Yeah, Brian. So you're actually putting a new entry in the method table.
You know,
Isn't that
I'm
how it
actually
works?
looking at that right now. I'm always sorry. I'm always surprised by that. Yeah. Let's find out, shall we? You guys pick the next topic, and I'll come back and tell you what I find.
I do want to argue in favor of the aliasing. I think I can give an example where it's very helpful. For example, I'm a find guy, and I use find, and I believe that's the correct one. If you use detect, you're just wrong. So I just want you to know that. However, but if you're in active record, right, it needs find for its main thing. Maybe less so now where we tend to use the other methods, but in old active record, find was a very important method, and we still use it for like ID lookups, right? And the problem is the way active record does its associations, it returns that association object in the middle. You know, when you call dot comments or whatever, it's actually an association object, and you can call class methods through it, right? So you can do dot comments dot find. Well, if you do that, you're going to get active records find. But what if I really wanted to load the comments and iterate through them using enumerable find? Well, you can actually do that. You just do dot comments dot detect, right? Because there's the alias there, because active record, you know, appropriated find, but I still have access to that other method, that other way to get to Ruby. And of course, you could do that in other ways. You could alias it yourself at you know, load time before active record was loaded or something. But I'm just saying that having those choices means that even if active record stomps on to me what is an important method, I can still get to it.
Right. You just
Yeah, it
have
definitely
to.
does.
It costs you 2 more keystrokes, though. My goodness.
That's right.
Yeah, that's probably going to be slower as well, right? Because the longer identifier. No, so yeah, it actually does make a copy of the method, which gets kind of complicated because you can undef. You can make an alias and then undef the other method so that Ruby can't look up in the class hierarchy and find that method, but you'll still have access to it. And then we know how alias method chain, how that sort of thing can sort of over time devolve into a real mess, right? So one of the things that I think are interesting about aliases is identifying which methods are aliased. I think Ruby needs better tools for that, and also where we keep consistency. If we're going to make something, it's almost like we're creating this duck typing on modules sort of thing, where I have this concept of comparable or enumerable, and then I want to override in a way and say, well, it's kind of like an enumerable because it responds to find, and that's kind of doing something that we call find in here. You know what I mean? And we start layering those concepts, and I think that complexity then maybe gets blamed on alias, where it's a question of have we taken a concept that was established in Ruby like find on an enumerable and then decided we wanted to layer a different concept on top of that, and is that where the complexity comes from?
That's a good point. The alias copying thing is actually a good thing, I think, because that's actually what makes things like alias method chain possible, in that you can copy the method somewhere else and then write a new version of that method that refers to the copy, right? So you can still get the old behavior, but modify it in a kind of wraparound filter kind of way, sort of. So I would say that I am pretty pro to Ruby's aliasing feature and don't necessarily consider it a minus, but I can definitely see why, people ask things like, well, which one do I use, length or size? And, the answer is it doesn't matter,
That's it, unless you're an active record.
That's right. Rails changes that rule, and then it does matter. That's right.
Right. So if I'm aliasing collect in my class, then I want to make sure I'm also aliasing map.
That's right.
I mean, not aliasing. I mean, overriding collect. Then I also want to override map so that my API to my class is consistent. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the good rule of thumb. And you can just write the one implementation and then use alias method to copy it over, right? So.
There you go. Yay. So we've been going through my list a little bit. James, I remember when you looked at the list, you said, I hate this list. So what were you thinking about?
That's true, I did. When Josh brought up this topic, he made a list of items that we should talk about. We've talked about 2 of those now. And I looked at the list and I immediately got mad. And I thought that was interesting because Dave Thomas has these great examples he'll show in his talks sometimes where like Ruby becomes particularly picky about syntax. And he has a great one with regular expressions. And he'll show it as just like A/B/C, kind of thing, and say, what does Ruby consider this? Is this division or a regular expression or whatever? Actually, it's more interesting if you take the 3 letters M/N/O, because of O being a regex modifier, meaning compile once. So, anyways,
interesting.
He'll show these very different examples and he'll like put a space in there, and all of a sudden Ruby treats it totally differently. And he'll put another space in there, and Ruby treats it differently again, turning it from like regex into division. Some of them are syntax errors where Ruby just throws up its hands and refuses to interpret it at all. And it's very interesting because Dave's point is that we always say we hate white space sensitive languages, but there are scenarios where Ruby is white space sensitive, and it'll change the meaning of your program or whatever. But Dave says, and I've always felt this way, that Ruby does this to try to be more helpful to us, to try to talk more like we do and less like a computer does, right? To try to be more friendly to our way of expressing things. Usually when we divide 2 things, we'll put spaces around it or whatever. So Ruby will use that rule to say they're probably dividing here, not using a regular expression or whatever. And that's I think that's interesting, and so I've always liked it that Ruby's grammar is complicated and horrible because it's got edge cases. It's a lot like English, right? English is complicated and horrible, and Ruby's grammar is kind of the same way. But I bet Brian has a very different opinion on that.
Actually, I love Ruby, and I find that the things like you're mentioning here, where the trailing /O, yeah, that's I think a thing that a lot of people don't even learn about regular expressions early on. You have these modifier flags that can follow that trailing closing character, and then Ruby has these other complex, I think they're rather complex ways to introduce things like a literal regular expression or a literal quoted array of strings, that sort of thing. And Josh even proposed a great one that you can use a percent, I think capital S, and then bookends, whatever you want to use for bookends, and then basically get an array of symbols out of that. I've dug around in the parser a whole bunch. We extracted MRI's Matz's Ruby's Ruby implementations parser into thing that we call Melbourne in Rubinius, and I've been working with the 1.9 grammar a ton recently, and it is complex. It's a very complex grammar. It's got a lot of state that the lexer, the part that's breaking up the string of characters into words in the language. It's got a lot of state that goes between that and the parser itself, the part that's figuring out that when you say, foo, and then an identifier, and then a curly brace, that you're sending attaching a block to that identifier and not doing a hash literal. These sort of things that we typically don't think about And I think the reason for that is, James, exactly what you said, that Ruby tries to be a more humane language and more in the realm of people talking about things. And we are fantastically good at disambiguating things. All around us, there's tons of stimuli constantly, words and facial expressions from people and body language and the phrases that they're saying. That we are constantly figuring out the right meaning for those things. And I find that a lot of Ruby code that I read, I have far less trouble understanding it than other languages. And partially that's because I spend a lot of time in it, but also I think I'm very sensitive to how much effort my brain is kind of trying to put into decoding symbols and stuff. And I mean, for instance, PHP, because of the different symbols that are used in the code, I spend a lot more time tracking each individual identifier, trying to figure out that $, $1, okay, identifier, I need to know what that means versus $, identifier, and this sort of thing. So I'm a huge fan of Ruby's more complex grammar. I think that sums it up.
So I realize I didn't actually answer Josh's question and talk about the things I'm not a fan of in Ruby. I think if I had to pick my two things, I would first attack our documentation. We are bad about that, and I've personally spent energy trying to make it better. Although I have learned something messing with Ruby's documentation, so I should probably mention that. But our API documentation is usually what's atrocious, that we tend just not to do that, and people end up just looking at the code because it's easier to read the code than figure it out from the terrible API documentation. But we do have other kinds of documentation that I think are just fantastic, like our blogosphere and stuff like that is so strong. If you read things like Avdi's blog and stuff, you can a lot of times get really in depth into concepts of Ruby and stuff like that, and so I find that side very good, but our API documentation very bad, and I'm becoming less convinced of the import of API documentation, at least at certain levels of learning. So I think really documentation in general is due for a breakthrough, that we're going to find a better way to do it at some point. But I would say Ruby is generally bad at that.
Can I stop you real quick, James? Because
Sure, yeah,
I have a couple of questions about that. First off, people are writing the documentation. So I'm wondering if the poor documentation or poor level of documentation, is that the fault of the language? Is it the fault of the tools that they're using to write the documentation, or is it the fault of the people? Is it kind of a combination of the three? Is there something I'm missing?
I think it's a really good question. I would love to know where it comes from, because other communities do this better than we do. If you look in the Java community, it's a standard practice to have good and complete documentation in the Java community, and that's not true in our community. And if I were to take a guess, and this is me totally guessing, but in Ruby's early days, there were language barrier problems, right? Because you had the Japan side and the English side. And I think that led to poor documentation in the beginning, and then that we kind of took it as a lead by example from there. So I think because we started off on the wrong foot on documentation, then we just kind of stayed on the wrong foot. But I admit I'm totally guessing.
So we'll blame it on Dave Thomas then.
Actually,
I love that guy. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Well, you can blame RDoc on Dave Thomas, but I don't think
right.
I think that there may be something to that, James. But I think that there's also you can't really compare Java and Ruby. They're apples and oranges, because when someone ships you a Java library, it's a bunch of compiled class files.
True.
When you grab a Ruby gem, you can always just open it up and look at the source code for it and see how it works.
So you're making the case that Java has the documentation because it's by necessity. You need it because you can't look at the code itself.
Yeah. And in a lot of cases with Ruby, you don't actually need documentation. It's actually really easy to just look at the code and see how it works.
That's true. I've seen people document methods that are basically just like one assignment or something, and you're sitting there going, so the documentation is longer than the method, and it's something so simple that it's more expressive in code than it ever will be in English.
I think that you guys are bringing up a good point, and for us, that doesn't matter. Like, if I'm working on a project and I want to see how some Rails plugin works, then I do a gem unpack, dump it in a directory, and go read the source, and that's true. I don't have a problem doing that, and it's very easy. However, I think it's important to realize that activities like that are extremely hostile to new programmers.
That's true.
I agree with you completely. I'm just saying that for experienced programmers and a lot of the early adopters for Ruby were, they were early adopters. They were doing that because they were cutting edge kind of people. So they were up to just reading the source code, and maybe there was some language barrier that was involved in how that arose. But the nature of Ruby has meant that it's possible to the community has made a huge amount of progress and grown, and people have been using Ruby libraries pretty well for years, even with what we might consider to be inadequate documentation, just because they can open up the Ruby source files and look at things.
Yeah. Now, we could rat hole this for an entire episode, so I'm going to give it back to James so that he can go on whatever else he was going to say.
So the other complaint I've had about Ruby in the past has definitely been speed. And I definitely want to qualify that because I'm not a big person that thinks that, Ruby needs to be as fast as C. I don't have any illusions like that. But and I often believe most of the time that in speed, it's actually an architecture change that gets you the boost that matters. Switching to an algorithm that does it more efficiently, or switching to a multi-processing model that allows you to do more work at once. I think you'll always get better bang for your buck out of something like that than actually doing, hoping that Ruby's inject method is fast enough. So I definitely, but at the same time, I felt like older versions of Ruby were unnecessarily slow. That when I did call inject, it took more time than it needed to. Based on the level of difficulty in that and stuff. And but I will say that between the new VMs and stuff, Ruby 1.9, Rubinius, and JRuby, I feel that pain a lot less. So we've come forward, I think, quite a bit, and I don't really view it as a major minus that I once did. But I definitely would like to see us to continually improve in that area as much as we can, recognizing that Ruby is a very difficult language to optimize, I'm assuming. Right, Brian?
It can be a difficult language to optimize, but there's also been the challenge has been sort of essentially the architecture of MRI before 1.9. So we've known about bytecode virtual machines for a long time, and we know that they're a great deal more efficient and faster than something that's just interpreting the abstract syntax tree of the grammar. So in some respects, James, I think your point is spot on. Ruby has lacked in the sophistication of the technology that we're pairing with the sophistication of the language. So our garbage collector story has not been the best. Our virtual machine story has not been the best, and our concurrency story has not been the best. These are all things that are being improved. Ruby 1.9 is making huge strides forward in terms of speed, and there's a lot of attention to the garbage collector now. Rubinius, from the start, was the idea of saying, okay, if we could get this is a quote from Evan, or a summary of what Evan often says. He's like, if we could get Ruby technology to where Smalltalk was a decade ago or 15 years ago, we would be light years ahead. So and then the JVM is a very complex project, and the complex language surrounding it. And I think corporate issues with Oracle and stuff like that make me very uncomfortable. But it's also a platform that has seen a tremendous amount of attention in terms of technology. So JRuby is definitely in concurrency garbage collection and just-in-time compilers generating machine code is taking taking Ruby forward. Rubinius, the whole goal of Rubinius is basically to make all those things directly available to Ruby. So I think it has been a problem with Ruby. It's something that I think that we are addressing. I think it's beyond past time that we address it, but I don't think that it's going to be one of the things that detract from Ruby in the future.
Do we have 2 minutes just to address a little of the ecosystem stuff?
Sure.
I guess.
So one of the things that I used to hear a lot about Ruby was that, it's a great little language, but there's really no library support for doing system programming.
I sat down with Wayne Seguin yesterday, and he was showing off his SM framework, the BDSM
that's a
project.
great framework.
And, we were just chatting for a few minutes, and he's like, I got to show you something cool. And he was showing it off to me. And I used to be a sysadmin. So, 5 minutes in, I'm sitting there going, oh, my gosh, dude, where was this 10 years ago, when I was sysadmining? Because it would have just saved a ton of time and trouble. You could have actually written shell scripts that made sense and stuff like that. And,
So I'm not just talking about shell scripting, but that's an important part of it. I'm talking about things like interfacing to low-level system services, network programming, dealing with process management. The kind of things that you typically program in shell scripts, and that you can, or hardcore math programming, what have you. There's a lot of things that the Python guys say, oh, look, this is great about Python. And then one of the big reasons that people go with JRuby is because there's all these JVM libraries that you can do pretty amazing stuff with. And if I'm being fair about this, I got to say Ruby is actually relatively weak in that area.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I do a little bit of system programming, and I find Ruby does pretty good in a POSIX environment, where I can fork processes and exec them into something else and stuff like that, and I really like that, and I use those features a lot. I guess I tend, when I want to, mess with process tables and stuff like that, I tend to just go the Unix way anyway, read from, the proper device to get the information I want or stuff like that. But I think I can understand what you're saying about, I've often felt like, that I've had to, dance around a way to kill the exact right process I wanted to kill because I didn't start it or whatever, and I have felt that sometimes. So I guess I can see where those libraries would come in. But
James, I remember listening to a podcast that you did a while back about how you did process monitoring in Ruby, and just how ridiculously complicated it was. That it took you a very long time to describe how all the hoops that you had to jump through to have a Sentinel process around watching the other processes, and that seems like that's a problem that got solved a while ago in just regular system programming.
Yeah,
so
that's probably a good point.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a very complex problem that is not really solved. If you look at the complexity of something like Unicorn, I think that does like zero downtime deploys and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that's required to do that. So I'm not surprised that's hard in Ruby. And I would just point out that one of the things about the languages, a language's libraries and stuff, if the language isn't up to the task of executing some library code fast enough, people tend to drop down to another language. So C has been the go-to language for Ruby. And way before RubyGems.org and way before RubyGems actually was a big deal, there was something called Ruby Application Archive, which is still out there. And there's probably something like 45,000, I think, different libraries on there. A good portion of those are C, bindings to C libraries. I think Ruby has a ton of libraries available to it. The question is whether or not I think whether or not they reduce the complexity of what you're trying to do enough, or whether or not they throw just this big chunk of C in your road. And so if you don't know C and the library doesn't function, can you get past it? But I think Ruby is not particularly poor on libraries. There's bindings to all kinds of crazy stuff out there. And if someone, if people really want to do more numeric processing, it's very easy to hook something up like GNU Scientific Library to Ruby. It's really easy to do that. Probably easier to do it than it is with Python, because we have a better interface to the garbage collector than reference count, for instance. So I think it's fairly strong. I think if people want to see more libraries, we need to like convince people that it's something they can actually accomplish. Write a library in Ruby and it'll perform well enough.
Right.
Okay. I agree with Brian that I'm old enough to remember the RAA and have used it a lot. And there's some gems on there people still don't use enough. A few of them, I believe, have even been brought forward to the 1.9 era. One of my personal favorites is NRA. So if you do need to do some very fast math, NRA basically lets you borrow C's numbers. And so you can do wicked fast math, a whole bunch of numbers at once. So that's a cool library. Another one I love is RB-Tree. That one may even be on GitHub now. NRA might be too. But RB-Tree is a red-black tree, a binary tree, which can be like a hash, but with really great lookup times if you know that you know how you're going to structure them, so they'll stay in an ordered way, and you can order through them, and the ordering doesn't necessarily have to be insertion order like it is with Ruby 1.9's hash. So RB-Tree is another great one I love. But I think we do have some tools. I have heard the complaints about the science and math libraries being pretty weak from time to time. I think that kind of represents a little bit of a difference in the Ruby mindset, though. A lot of times we'll just shell out and pipe it into some command line tool, whereas, a lot of, Java programmers would prefer to have the whole thing happen in the JVM and get all that. But Rubyists aren't afraid to package up some data and throw it down a pipe, I think is kind of a difference.
Nice. So we can disambiguate and alias our math data and pipe it off to doing some picks now.
That's right.
That was awful. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm satisfied.
Well, with that, I think we're going to have to move on to our picks if we're going to stay on track with time. Since you're satisfied, we'll let you go ahead and do the first pick or picks.
Okay, cool. My first pick is a blog post, and it's about stand-up meetings. So I think that a lot of Rubyists are prone to agile development, and we use extreme programming practices, and one of those practices is a daily stand-up meeting. And yet there's a lot of us who don't really have any kind of training in how this works. People think doing a morning stand-up is just standing up and talking about whatever, and sometimes these meetings can devolve into meetings rather than what a stand-up is really meant to be. So I saw an update recently of one of the canonical descriptions of stand-up meetings. It's by Jason Yip. He's a thought worker, and he wrote this a while back, but he just updated it with some new material and better descriptions. We'll put a link in the show notes, but it's on Martin Fowler's website, and it's a surprisingly long blog post because stand-ups are just these quick little things, but there's a lot of material in this post, and the thing that I like about it is that it talks about the different ways that you can do things. It's not, this is a one-size-fits-all process. It's, you have a small team, here's how you do it. You have a larger team, here's how you do it. Oh, you have all the stakeholders present, here's what you want to do. Oh, you don't have all the stakeholders present, here's a way to deal with that. So it's a really great read if you're doing morning stand-ups and you don't feel like you're getting the most out of them. This is definitely something worth reading. So and then my other pick is office toys. So I just ordered something from officeplayground.com, and it's a water-filled bouncy ball full of flashing LED lights and glitter, and it's
God,
amazingly
awesome.
entrancing. Yeah, it's great.
I think my kids would like that.
It's great. So I looked around and I found OfficePlayground.com, and they were the only place that had these things. A friend of mine gave me one of these, and I thought it was so great I needed to buy more. So Office Playground is good for like fidgety little things. And then the other site that I really like for these kind of things is ThinkGeek.com, which in their geek toys section, and they have just some really incredible stuff like push pins shaped like ninja stars that have been embedded in your cork board, Aperture Science coffee mugs. So and they're of course the place that came up with the child-sized eviscerated tauntaun sleeping bag.
Geek is also awesome if you're a parent. Check out their kids section. I buy my kid like tons of stuff off of there.
Yeah. Anyway, I think you pretty much can never have enough fun, distracting things in your office. So
I have a feeling I'm going to wind up buying stuff off of ThinkGeek for my kids, and my wife's going to look at them. What is this?
So that's it for me today.
All right. All right. Go ahead, James. What are your picks?
So I think I'm going to make an unusual pick and probably not popular. Let's see if I can get hate mail for this one. But since Rails...
No! Oh, sorry.
Since Rails 3.1 was released last night, I thought I would go ahead and make a pick that for Rails 3.0, not 3.1. And while I'm at it, why don't I go ahead and throw in a pick for Snow Leopard? And all I'm really saying here is, like, a long time ago, I used to be definitely the bleeding edge guy who always updated the second something was released. I mean, Apple announced, a new operating system. I ordered it that second and, installed it. And while it was always cool to play with the new shiny, you always run into things that like break immediately, and you have to wait on people to get the updates out and stuff like that. And then eventually you get back to where you get a great working system and stuff. So I've actually, at Herculean effort, been resisting like the upgrade to Lion because I have two pieces of software that aren't yet compatible with it, but in both cases they're working on it. It should be out soon. And then the upgrade to Rails 3.1, I was looking at it last night. And it's like, yeah, and then I'm gonna have to change all the asset stuff and this one app and stuff, and it's working just fine, and the asset stuff doesn't really buy me anything I haven't already figured out, how to handle. So anyways, I kind of resisted upgrading an app that I'm currently working on to Rails 3.1, and I'm not saying don't upgrade. Of course, I still love playing with new tech and all that. I'm just saying you don't have to upgrade the day something comes out, and if you choose to wait a little bit, then it's a more pleasant experience in that you can slide up when your stuff already works there and things like that. So I'm recommending we try, although I realize it's horribly hard to, not being the very first person to use a piece of technology.
That is awesome, James. I worked at Apple a while ago, and the QA team that I worked with had some email letterhead that they would use that said, Apple Computer, where quality is job 1.1.1.
That's awesome.
Oh, man. So, James, the anti-fanboy.
I'm trying it. It's my new strategy. But you know what? Like, everybody got Lion, and some people were like complaining on Twitter, and I'm like, it's still working for me fine, and Apple's not going to cancel support for Snow Leopard, in the next 30 days or something. I've got a little time,
It's funny because about a week before they released Lion, I had Snow Leopard crash on me like 3 times. And then the week after they released Lion, it crashed on me another 2 times. And I'm like, screw this. It can't be any worse going to Lion. And I've upgraded and hadn't had any problems. So.
Oh, that's good.
But anyway, Brian.
I gotta say, I'm really excited about the upcoming Rails 3.1 release.
It's out, Josh. Haven't
That
you
happened
seen?
yet? That happened yesterday.
No, the 3.1.1 release.
Oh, 3.1.
Yeah, you and
one.
James are our
So
skeptics. All right, go ahead, Brian.
I have a couple of things. One is people are starting to learn about a concurrency mechanism called actors, and I think it's fantastic. It's quite a bit. It's old. It's been around for a long time. Some great research has been done on it, and there is a guy who's got a terrific blog called "It's Actors All the Way Down," where he covers a lot of the simple patterns in using actors. Rubinius has had an actor implementation from Mental Guy and Tony Alcieri since I think 2007. So within the first year, but it hasn't gotten the attention that I think that it deserves in the Ruby community. Another guy, Mike Perham, has written a thing called Girl Friday for doing background processing that also uses actors. And in Rubinius, we've removed the GIL in 2.0, and we're really excited to have full Ruby concurrency. And that can be a wonderful thing or a huge can of worms. And I hope that people aren't going to take this and necessarily go the full thread and locking route. I think that there's better things for us to use. So here's I guess we'll have the link in the whatever people can access, is a blog, though, from a guy who's written an entire language around the concept of actors. So it's gonna broaden your mind a little bit. The other thing that I think is really fascinating is that Ruby is an object-oriented language, and we sometimes think everything about being object-oriented means everything is sending messages to objects. And I want to introduce the idea that there's actually some stuff in Ruby, the reflection methods like respond to and instance methods and things like this that can be used in code to make things more complicated than they need to be and actually destroy some of the object-orientedness of code. I can't tell you how much it frustrates me to see code that says, if respond to, call this method. I think that's a terrible perversion of the idea of sending messages to objects and letting them figure it out. So my other pick is actually a blog post about a concept called mirrors. And you can Google for mirrors and you'll find Gilad Brach's paper on it. But this is from Alan Worfsbrock. And it's a couple of blog posts about using mirrors in JavaScript for reflection. And basically, the idea of a mirror is an object that takes on the responsibility of providing you reflection information about an object rather than requiring the object to tell you directly. So he's done a couple of posts. I'm going to link to his first post. This mirrors idea is something that we're really, really interested in exploring in Rubinius, figuring out how we can actually make a better separation between logic in your programs and object-oriented structure and things like understanding how your program is behaving, how the code is behaving, and how the objects are behaving. So those are my picks.
All right.
Brian, kind of along your last one, it's always bothered me that caller in Ruby returns an array of strings, and then I have to parse it out to find the file and the line and all that, I've always thought it should return an array of objects, of that, I could call line on or file on or whatever.
I absolutely agree. And in Rubinius, our backtrace is actually an array of objects, and we provide an MRI-compatible array of strings. But you can, instead of using caller, you can use the VM facility directly and get back this array of location objects, and you can find out a lot of information about it. So I absolutely agree. I would love to see that aspect of Ruby objectified properly.
Awesome.
All right. I guess it's my turn. I've been trying to think of what my picks would be, and I'm kind of drawing a blank. I was on the road for most of the day yesterday, and got into Boulder last night.
So your pick is Boulder, Colorado?
Sure. I've seen about 6 blocks of it, other than what I saw driving in. I guess my couple of picks. One thing that's been really nice on the way out here is having my iPad and having the Netflix app on it. It just helps me relax when I can just kind of hang out, lay on the hotel bed, prop the iPad up and just watch a show. And, so I guess those are my picks. They're the iPad and the Netflix app for the iPad. Just the streaming content, there's a ton of it. It's awesome. So you just hook into the hotel Wi-Fi and watch. And one other pick that I usually use on trips like this is Skype. And not just for recording episodes like this, but actually it's nice to do the video chats with my kids, my wife, just see them. And, my kids get all excited and say things like, "Daddy, you're on the computer." And, they're amazed that they can see me on the computer. But anyway, so those are my picks. And, they make these conference trips a whole lot easier. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I just want to thank our panelists again for coming on to the show. Once again, our panelists are Brian Ford. If you want
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the invite.
You are most welcome. We also have James Edward Gray.
Thanks for coming, Brian, and thanks for everything you do on Rubinius for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh Susser.
Hey, yeah, it was a good time as always. Although I got to say, I really miss having David on the show.
Yeah, I don't know where he is today, but
we'll track him down.
Yeah. And I'm Charles Max Wood. A few things that you may want to know. The show notes are at rubyrogues.com. That's RUBYROGUES.com. You can also find us in iTunes. And if you look us up and you like the show, then leave us a review and let us know what you think. You can also follow any of us on Twitter. We'll put links up on the show notes. And, if you have any feedback for the show, then you can tweet to @RubyRogues. And or you can tweet me. I'm CMaxW, and we do take that into account. And then again, if you want to just reach us through any other means, most of that information is up on the show notes. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Also, as a reminder, don't forget that the Ruby Rogues is reading Exceptional Ruby by Avdi Grimm this month. We are going to discuss it on our early September episode. I think it's September 7th or 8th, something like that. So if you want to follow along, get the book, read along with us. You can send in questions to us if you like. We'll grill Avdi on your behalf. And you can learn about this awesome book that's out in the Ruby community right now. So join us for the book club in September.
Bye.